Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling saw when he looked at Hannah Clarke. That's all anyone at Mercy General saw during her 3 years in the cardiac unit, a quiet woman in navy scrubs who moved through the fluorescent corridors like she was trying not to exist. They didn't know. They had no idea that the hands adjusting their 4 lines at 3 a.m. had once held a bleeding child steady under mortar fire in Sangin Valley. They didn't know that the woman they dismissed in break-room conversations had carried a warrior through a minefield at age 22, her uniform soaked in his blood and her own, her breath steady as she whispered to him the whole way, "Stay with me. Stay with me. I've got you." No one knew. No one asked. The morning shift at Mercy General began like all the others. Hannah arrived at 6:36 a.m., 12 minutes early, moving through the automatic doors with the kind of efficiency that came from understanding that early meant less chance of collision, less chance of being in the way. The air inside hit her first, that particular hospital smell, a mix of antiseptic and something underneath it that never quite washed clean, something organic and old. She'd smelled worse. Copper and dust. Burning diesel. Fear that had soaked into fabric and wouldn't leave. The parking lot outside had been grey with April rain, the kind that didn't fall so much as settle, and it still clung to her hair in fine droplets that caught the harsh hospital lighting. Hannah moved to her locker in the back of the staff area, the one near the supply closet where no one lingered. Her hands were steady as she opened the door, hands that had placed central lines in the dark using only tactile sensation, hands that could identify a cardiac arrhythmia by the feel of a pulse alone. She reached past her spare scrubs and her folded cardigan to the jacket hanging in the back, the one she wore only on cold days. Her fingers found the lining without thought, without looking. The unit patch was there where it always was, worn thin at the edges, the colors faded from coyote brown and forest green to something like dust. Sangin. Charlie Platoon. 2003, she touched it once, the way some people touched a cross or a photograph, and then she hung the jacket back up. 3 years of mornings. 3 years of this ritual that no one else saw or knew or could possibly understand. The cardiac unit hummed with the particular energy of early morning, ventilators breathing their mechanical rhythm, monitors casting their blue-green glow across empty hallways. Hannah moved through the space like someone who'd learned early that stillness was sometimes the best invisibility. 37 years old. A senior chief petty officer discharged from active duty status into a life that didn't have a name. Witness protection wasn't the right term, the paperwork called it something else, something with letters and numbers, something that meant her references were carefully constructed civilians, her employment history deliberately sparse, her real name buried so deep that only 4 people in this country knew the truth about who she actually was. One of them was dead. One of them worked for the FBI. 2 of them worked at the Pentagon. Dr. Sterling arrived at 7:15 a.m. with his Italian leather briefcase and his Rolex Submariner watch, the one that cost more than Hannah's monthly rent. He was 53, handsome in the way that money made handsome, his grey temples perfectly groomed, his white coat tailored to fit. He moved through Mercy General like a man accustomed to taking up space, to being the center of gravity wherever he stood. The other physicians greeted him with the particular deference that came from knowing he had connections. His brother-in-law was the hospital administrator, his golf buddy was on the board of trustees, his quarterly billing for phantom cardiac procedures was generating what the compliance office had privately noted as a significant revenue anomaly. Hannah had noticed. Of course she had. She'd noticed the 47 extra biopsy charges for patients who'd never had biopsies. She'd noticed the equipment fees for diagnostic equipment that existed only in the hospital's accounting system. She'd noticed that Dr. Sterling had become wealthy in a way that didn't match his salary, and that wealth seemed to multiply every quarter with invisible precision. She'd also noticed that no one else seemed to see it, or more accurately, no one else was looking. Medicine wasn't ethics anymore. It was business. Business had winners and losers. Hannah, by the arithmetic of her life, had already lost everything that mattered. The cardiac unit's main station had 12 monitors displaying 12 patients' hearts, each one a small drama of electrical activity and oxygenation. Hannah began her morning assessment, moving from patient to patient with the kind of systematic attention that came from 12 years of field medicine, 12 years of understanding that the difference between life and death was often just observation, just the willingness to look at what was actually there instead of what you expected to see. Room 305, the monitors showed normal sinus rhythm, but the patient's breathing had changed, become shallower. She made a note. Room 308, oxygen saturation was holding but dropping in minute increments that most people would miss. In room 312, an elderly man named Raymond Chen was recovering from a triple bypass. His foot line had shifted slightly during the night, and the intravenous fluid was running too fast, the needle pulling at the vein, the insertion point showing the early signs of inflammation. Hannah moved to his bedside with her typical quiet efficiency, checking the vital signs on the monitor, running her fingers along the line of the 4 to feel for complications, her touch barely a whisper against his arm. "Let me adjust this," she said to him, and her voice was the kind of calm that came from having said it 1,000 times under conditions infinitely worse than a hospital room. She found the medication kit, selected a 14-gauge replacement catheter, and began the process of relocating the line. Her movements were economical and precise, no wasted motion, no hesitation, the kind of practiced expertise that revealed itself only in execution. She'd learned this skill in a field hospital in Helmand Province with rocket fire walking down the compound wall, with patients bleeding out faster than transfusions could replace what was leaving their bodies, with the singular focus that came from understanding that every second and every motion had a weight measured in human survival. The vein at Raymond's wrist was good. Her needle found it on the first try. The flashback of blood appeared in the catheter hub with the perfect visual confirmation that she was exactly where she needed to be. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Sterling had walked past room 312 at precisely that moment, his eyes taking in the scene. Hannah bent forward with absolute concentration, her movement speaking a fluency with medical procedure that transcended the usual nurse's routine. He stood in the doorway for exactly 7 seconds, watching her secure the line with clear tape, watching her check the flow rate, watching her make a notation on the chart without a single word of self-importance. And what he saw wasn't a skilled nurse protecting a vulnerable patient. What he saw was a threat. It was a recognition that came from somewhere instinctive in him, the way a predator recognizes a creature that moves in a way it doesn't understand. Hannah had a competence that existed outside the hierarchy he controlled. She had a knowledge that hadn't come from a residency program or a prestigious fellowship. She had hands that knew things those hands shouldn't know. And 30 minutes later, when Dr. Sterling discovered that the flag billing irregularities on his desk had Hannah's handwriting on them, his expression became something carved from stone. He closed his office door. He pulled up her employee file. Hannah Clarke. 3 years. Clean record. No complaints. No write-ups. No obvious reason to look closer. Except that his empire had a small leak, and that leak had a name, and the name had a face that he'd just watched moving with the kind of precision that belonged in an operating room, not a cardiac monitoring unit. He picked up his phone. He made a call to a colleague at the state medical board, a favor for a favor, nothing unusual. He asked about Hannah's background, her references, her previous employment history. The colleague would pull the files. The colleague would find carefully constructed civilian employers, all legitimate but all somehow vague when you looked closely. A clinic in Portland. A home health agency in Denver. Nothing that quite added up to a linear career path, nothing that told a coherent story about how a woman became this good at what she did. What he didn't know was that Hannah had just saved Raymond Chen's life. The inflammation from the previous foot placement had been early sepsis, an infection that would have killed him within 48 hours if her hands hadn't moved when they did, if her eyes hadn't caught what others would have missed, if she hadn't understood instinctively that sometimes the difference between recovery and death was someone paying attention to small details that didn't seem to matter. She also didn't know that at 2:14 p.m. that same afternoon, a Navy SEAL named Michael Reeves would arrive in room 447 of Mercy General, his chest wrapped in bandages that covered wounds from a firefight in Sangin Valley that had happened 3 weeks ago. His heart was failing. His left ventricle was struggling to push blood through a system compromised by shrapnel damage and the cellular inflammation that came from surviving explosions. The hospital had given him a room and a monitor and a prognosis of 2 weeks, maybe 3. They'd done the standard workup. They'd ordered cardiac imaging. They'd consulted cardiothoracic surgery, who'd reviewed the films and declined to operate, the damage too extensive, the risk too high. Michael Reeves was, in the language of medicine, expectant care only. Waiting to die. Being kept comfortable. No one knew that he'd been a child when Hannah Clarke pulled him from the rubble of a compound in Sangin after an IED detonation. No one knew that she'd carried him 2 kilometers through a minefield with her own blood running down her left side from shrapnel wounds she'd ignored until he was in the helicopter. No one knew that she'd whispered to him the whole way in a voice like still water, "I've got you, little man. I've got you. Stay with me." No one knew that she'd held his hand as they loaded him onto the aircraft, that she'd made him look at her face instead of the destruction behind them, that she'd given him the only thing she had left to give, the unwavering certainty that someone would not let him fall. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor at 2:19 p.m. Michael Reeves was wheeled into his room on a stretcher, accompanied by a Navy liaison officer and the particular silence that came with dying. Hannah was working cardiac monitoring that shift. She would see his name when she pulled the updated patient list. But that moment hadn't come yet. The afternoon was still unfolding. The rain was still falling outside, the kind of Savannah rain that sounded like whispered conversation against the windows. Dr. Sterling was still in his office, making phone calls. Michael Reeves was still unconscious, still fighting against his own failing heart, still waiting for someone to recognize him, to know what he'd already survived, to understand that he'd earned the right to something other than being left alone to die. Hannah moved through the day with her usual invisible efficiency. She checked her patients. She documented her observations. She responded to the requests of physicians with the particular deference that came from understanding her place in the hierarchy. "Of course, doctor." "Right away, doctor." "I'll monitor that closely, doctor." The words came easily because they were practiced, because she'd learned long ago that objecting to anything accomplished nothing except drawing attention, and drawing attention was dangerous for people whose real names lived in redacted files. She was good at being quiet. She was good at being overlooked. She was very good at surviving by being the kind of person no one remembered 5 minutes after she left the room. But Michael Reeves would remember. He would wake in the night gasping, his heart throwing erratic rhythms, his blood oxygen dropping, his body failing in the precise way that happened when the human machine had taken too much damage. And Hannah would be there, not because protocol required it, but because some part of her would sense a presence that called to a version of herself she'd buried 3 years ago. Some part of her would know, before she knew, what she would have to do. Some part of her, the part that had never actually left Sangin, that had never actually stopped being a senior chief petty officer, that had never actually accepted that some lives were acceptable casualties in the mathematics of institutional medicine, would make a choice that would change everything. But that moment was still hours away. For now, Hannah moved through her shift, invisible and steady, her hands knowing things no one asked about, her past sealed in redacted files and in the faded patch she touched every morning, and in the particular darkness that came from surviving what most people couldn't imagine, let alone live through. Room 312 smelled like antiseptic and fear, the kind that lingers when family members realize their loved one might not walk out of the hospital alive. Mrs. Patterson lay propped at 45 degrees, her thin arm extended for the adjustment Hannah had been requested to make, and her 2 adult children occupied the visitor chairs like sentries, the son in a pressed shirt that said he took this seriously, the daughter with her phone already out, documenting everything, trusting nothing. Hannah approached the bedside with her supplies arranged in her hands the way she'd arranged medical gear in a desert bunker 15 years ago, organized, efficient, purposeful. She was adjusting the flow rate on Mrs. Patterson's for drip, her fingers steady as she worked the regulator to exactly 80 milliliters per hour, the precise rate Dr. Sterling had ordered on rounds that morning, when the door swung open without a knock. Sterling swept in like weather moving across open water, his presence making the air pressure change, and his voice emerged at a volume designed to carry beyond the room. "Nurse Clarke, step away from that line immediately." His eyes were on her hands, but his words were for the family watching. "Did you even check the flow rate, or are we just guessing today?" Hannah's hand stilled. One measured breath. The kind of breath that comes from muscle memory, from training that teaches you to control your body's response to threat. "Doctor, the rate is precisely what you ordered." Her voice remained level, matter-of-fact. 80 milliliters per hour. Current time, 10:08 a.m. Verified 3 minutes ago. Sterling moved closer, close enough that the daughter set down her phone and the son straightened in his chair. And yet somehow our little lost lamb manages to question protocol she barely understands. The nickname hung in the air like smoke. Perhaps if you spent less time playing detective with billing records and more time learning basic nursing, Mrs. Patterson wouldn't be at risk from incompetence. The son made a sound, a soft intake of breath, the beginning of a word that never finished. Hannah felt the tear escape before she could stop it, hot against her cheekbone, and she reached up with her free hand and wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her gaze holding Sterling's with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Her voice emerged like still water. "I've survived worse than you, doctor, and I'm still standing." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Mrs. Patterson's voice, thin but steady, "She's right, you know. This young woman's been perfect with me." Sterling's jaw tightened. He left without responding, his shoes clicking against the tile floor in a rhythm that sounded like artillery in the distance, methodical, approaching, inevitable. Hannah finished adjusting the line, her hands moving on their own while her mind catalogued what had just happened. He'd shown them something. He'd wanted them to see him diminish her, to believe it, to spread it. The tear had been miscalculation on her part, a momentary crack in composure, but she'd closed it fast. Sterling's problem was that he'd exposed his strategy too early, and Mrs. Patterson, sharp as a blade despite her failing heart, had seen through it. The break room was the size of a storage closet pretending to be a space where nurses could breathe. For mismatched chairs, a refrigerator from 2003, a coffee maker that gurgled and hissed, and fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects in a jar. Hannah entered it the next day with her lunch in a plastic container, a thermometer in her hand showing the refrigerator's temperature at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and found 3 of the senior nurses, women who'd smiled at her in the hallway for 3 years, who'd asked about her weekend, who'd covered her shifts when she needed them, standing with their coffee cups gathered like flowers in their hands. The moment she stepped into the room, they moved. Not rushed, not obvious enough to cause a scene, but coordinated with the precision of people who'd rehearsed this, or at least understood it was coming. Elena set her cup on the counter and stood. Then Miriam. Then Dr. James from the surgical unit, who'd once let Hannah assist on a difficult line placement and told her afterward that she had good instincts. 3 chairs became empty. The door swung shut behind them, and Hannah could hear their voices resume in the hallway, a normal, bright, as if they'd merely stepped away for a moment. The refrigerator hummed its electronic song. She put her lunch container on the shelf, noted the time, 11:33 a.m., and left the break room. No one spoke to her for the rest of the shift. No one made eye contact beyond what protocol demanded. The charge nurse, Patricia, who trained her on the 4 protocols, gave report with her eyes fixed on the computer screen. By Thursday morning, the unit board next to the nursing station displayed Dr. Sterling's formal declaration. It was typed on hospital letterhead, official enough to make it real, and printed in red ink that made Hannah's name look like an accusation. Disciplinary action, insubordination and failure to follow established protocols. Nurse H to Clarke, formal warning. Basis, questioning of physician direction and deviation from documented procedure protocols. Approved by Dr. James Sterling, MD, Chief of Internal Medicine. Every staff member who passed that board would see it. By shift change, half the hospital would know her name was on it. The other half would know by morning. Sterling had done this not because it would change anything in her personnel file, one formal write-up was barely a breeze, but because he wanted everyone to know that she was marked, flagged, unsafe, the kind of employee who questioned authority and had to be watched. Hannah saw the board during the 7 a.m. shift change. She stood in front of it for 4 seconds, reading her name in red ink, feeling the weight of 30 nurses' eyes on her periphery, and then she touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, a gesture so small no one could read it but her, and turned to the medication cart. The charge nurse averted her eyes. 2 new admissions came through. Hannah handled them with the same competence she brought to every patient, the same precision, the same invisible labor. She was checking a post-operative wound on a knee replacement patient in room 408. The surgery had gone well, the dressing was clean, vital signs stable, when she noticed the door to room 447 was open. Through the gap, she could see a bed, and on that bed, a man who hadn't been there yesterday morning. The admission board had listed him that afternoon: naval patient, trauma history, cardiac complications, isolation precautions in place. She'd noted it the way she noted everything, a detail in the vast machinery of hospital operations. But something about the angle of his shoulders, the set of his unconscious face, made her pause mid-step. She finished the wound check. She documented the vitals: blood pressure 118/76, heart rate 88, oxygen saturation 96%, temperature 99.1. She cleaned up her supplies with deliberate care and moved back into the hallway. The door to room 447 was still open. The code on his chart read SEAL, Special Operations Patient, Compartmentalized Care, Minimal Staff. What they didn't know was that Hannah's hands had already started moving before her mind caught up. She found his admission paperwork in the nursing station, pulled it to her desk, and read. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Chen. Admitted, emergency transfer from Naval Medical Center, Bethesda. Chief complaint: chest trauma, cardiac complications, post-operative management. Date of injury: 18 years, for months, 12 days ago. Location of injury: Sangin Valley, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The paper trembled against the desk. Not her hands. Never her hands. But the paper itself seemed to vibrate with the weight of what she was reading. She pulled the operative notes. A firefight. Civilian casualties during extraction. 1 minor casualty evacuated by combat medic, call sign Angel 6, during the operation, name redacted, record sealed. The timestamps matched. The location matched. The detail about the minefield coordinates matched. 20 years dissolved. She saw a child, maybe 7 years old, trapped under concrete and rebar that had fallen when the first round hit the market. His small hand reaching up toward her face as she crawled through the dust. The sound of his breathing, thin and panicked. The weight of him against her chest as she ran through the minefield, each step a prayer, each breath a calculation of probability, her own voice screaming for cover fire as the rounds walked closer. The helicopter rotors drowning out everything except her own heartbeat, impossibly fast, impossibly loud. She set the paperwork down. She set her hands flat on the desk. She counted backward from 10 in French, then in Arabic, then in numbers that had no language, just pure mathematics. Dr. Sterling found her still there, staring at the paperwork without reading it. Nurse Clarke, his voice emerged like something sharp cutting through cloth, I'm sure you have other patients who actually require your attention. This case is being managed by specialists. She looked up at him. His eyes were calculating, trying to read what she'd been doing at the nursing station with a classified patient's chart. She could see him trying to determine if she'd discovered something, found something, learned something she shouldn't know. Yes, doctor, she said. Her voice had dropped an octave without her intending it. I was documenting a wound check from room 408. She returned the chart to its proper place and turned back to the medication cart. Sterling remained in the doorway for 7 seconds. She counted them, the way she'd counted heartbeats in a medevac helicopter once, before his shoes clicked away down the hallway. That night, alone in her apartment with the city sounds of Savannah filtering through the windows, sirens in the distance, traffic on the interstate 2 miles away, the hum of her refrigerator, Hannah sat on her bed and pulled the unit patch from her jacket lining. The fabric was worn thin from 20 years of handling, the embroidered insignia barely visible against the faded background. The name stitched across the bottom, Angel 6. Not a name. A call sign. A designation. A life that didn't officially exist. She held it in her hands, the way she'd held that child's hand as she pulled him from the rubble. She whispered to the empty room, to the darkness, to the version of herself who'd made a choice in a Savannah hospital 20 minutes ago to not claim what was rightfully hers. I found you, Marcus. I won't lose you again. But that moment was still hours away. For now, Hannah moved through her shift, invisible and steady, her hands knowing things no one asked about, her past sealed in redacted files and in the faded patch she touched every morning, and in the particular darkness that came from surviving what most people couldn't imagine, let alone live through. Sterling had marked her with a formal warning. He'd orchestrated her isolation with the precision of someone who understood how institutions worked. He believed he was dismantling her, piece by piece, making her so isolated, so damaged by public humiliation, that she would either quit or become desperate enough to make a mistake. What he didn't understand was that desperate was her native language, and mistakes were something she'd learned not to make. The chart on room for 47 read like a casualty report. Hannah had memorized every line during her evening rounds: chest trauma from small arms fire, fragmentation wounds across the anterior thorax, 3 surgeries in Baghdad followed by transport to Mercy General with complications the surgical team couldn't explain. Acute pericardial effusion. Cardiac tamponade risk. A Navy SEAL with the kind of injuries that looked survivable until they weren't. She'd walked past his room 3 times that shift, each time slowing her pace without breaking stride, each time reading the name on the board, LCPO Marcus Webb. 23 years old. The chart listed no family contact, no emergency number, just a terse medical history and a series of clinical notes that made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't explain to anyone. The other doctors had already written his ending. Dr. Reeves had left a note at 4 p.m., palliative care consult recommended. Cardiac function declining. Not a surgical candidate. Dr. Haverman's assessment at 2 p.m. was shorter, comfort measures only. The cardiology resident had drawn a line through her own initial consult, replacing it with a single sentence: terminal trajectory. Focus on pain management. Every physician who'd seen him had reached the same conclusion, not in words, but in the way they stopped trying. The way they turned away from the monitors and didn't look back. Hannah stood at the nursing station, pretending to write in a patient chart while her eyes tracked the monitors on the bank of screens. Room for 47 was 4th from the left. Cardiac rhythm steady but weakening. Blood pressure dropping in increments, 128 to 126, 126 to 124. The kind of slow descent that looked manageable until it stopped being manageable at all. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless frequency overhead, and she became aware of something else, the sound of her own breathing, controlled, measured, the tactical breathing she'd learned in a place called Sangin Valley 20 years ago. For counts in. Hold. For counts out. The kind of breathing you did when your mind needed to stay separate from what your body was feeling. She knew who that patient was. She knew the moment she'd read the name, the moment she'd looked at his photograph in the chart and recognized the shape of his face, sharper now, scarred, but the same boy she'd pulled from rubble in Helmand Province when his entire convoy had been destroyed and he was bleeding out underneath a collapsed wall with both legs pinned and shrapnel embedded in his chest. She'd carried him 200 meters through a minefield, her hands under his arms, his weight nearly a full drag across her body, her radio screaming contact, contact, contacts, and she'd screamed back nothing, just the sound of her breathing and his and the percussion of small arms fire so close the bullets sounded like they were coming from inside her own skull. She'd gotten him to the helicopter. She'd watched them load him and she'd never seen him again because 15 minutes after that helicopter lifted off, everything changed. The manila folder on her desk contained the fabricated civilian references. The bookstore owner in Vermont who didn't exist. The retired teacher in Portland who was actually a deep cover asset who would say exactly what was needed if anyone called. Her entire pre-nursing life compressed into 3 pages of lies that looked perfect because she'd learned how to make them look perfect. 3 years at Mercy General Hospital. Impeccable patient reviews. A quiet nurse who kept to herself and never caused problems. An invisible woman in scrubs. Dr. Sterling had called an emergency meeting with the board chairman at 7 a.m. Hannah hadn't been there, but she'd learned about it the way information moved through a hospital, whispers in hallways, a suddenly cold shoulder from the nursing director, the way conversation stopped when she entered the break room. The first phone call had been clinical. Board chairman mentioned concerning behavioral patterns. Sterling's voice smooth as oil, suggesting Hannah had been flagging irregularities in billing practices that appear to be attempts to undermine physician authority and damage the hospital's financial standing. The chairman had listened. People listened to Sterling. He had the kind of authority that made others bend toward him without even being asked. 17 years as chief of cardiology. Publications in prestigious journals. A research grant with his name on it. Connections that went deep into the hospital's power structure. The second phone call, at 8 a.m., had gone to the compliance director. "I've become concerned about Dr. Clarke's patient care decisions," Sterling had said, and the lie was so smooth it moved past the truth without even acknowledging its existence. A full audit of her decisions over the past 2 years might be warranted. "I'm seeing patterns that trouble me." He didn't say what patterns. He didn't have to. The word audit was enough. The suggestion that something was hidden was enough. By 10 a.m., the investigators had appeared in HR. 2 people with badges and careful expressions, asking about Hannah's background check, her employment history, the gaps between jobs. They'd pulled her file, pointed at the deliberately vague years between her military separation and nursing school, asked specific questions about why her previous employers had such limited information to provide. "She's been difficult to trace," one of them had said to HR, as if difficulty to trace was itself an indictment. They'd called her references. Hannah's phone had buzzed at 11 a.m. with a message from the deep cover asset in Vermont, "Questions about your employment timeline. Answered as prepared. Suggest you be ready to explain the gaps yourself." The retired teacher who didn't exist had said all the right things, but even a perfect lie could only do so much. The questions themselves were the damage. The investigation itself was the weapon. It didn't matter if they found proof, the investigation was already proof, to anyone who was watching, that something was wrong. Dr. Sterling had orchestrated it with surgical precision. Not the blunt force of a frontal attack, but the careful escalation of someone who knew how institutions worked. Suggest a problem. Let the system investigate itself. Let the rumor do the real work while maintaining complete professional plausibility. By noon, she'd been removed from room 447's case. "Nurse Chen will be taking over the SEAL case," the nursing director had said, barely meeting her eyes. "You're reassigned to post-op recovery effective immediately." Hannah had nodded. She hadn't asked why. She hadn't protested. She'd simply gathered her tablet and moved to the other wing where the recovery patients emerged from surgery in fragments, confused, medicated, their nervous systems slowly rebooting into consciousness. She'd checked vitals and adjusted drips and smiled when families asked how their loved ones were doing and didn't let her hands shake, didn't let her voice crack, didn't do any of the things her body wanted to do, which was to find Dr. Sterling and ask him directly if he'd really calculated how much of his life he was willing to risk to bury her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that at 4:17 p.m., during her break, she'd accessed the computer system from a terminal in a supply closet and pulled up room 447 again. She wasn't supposed to. The order had been explicit. But her fingers moved on their own, muscle memory from 20 years of doing things she wasn't supposed to do, of moving through systems built to stop people like her and sliding through the gaps anyway. The chart showed declining cardiac function. Fluid accumulating around the heart. The pericardial effusion was worsening. The right atrial pressure was rising. Every parameter was a line going in the wrong direction. The cardiology note from that afternoon was definitive: comfort measures only. Patient not candidate for intervention. Focus on pain control and family comfort. Hannah read the note 3 times. She recognized the handwriting. It wasn't Dr. Reeves. It was Sterling. He'd taken over the case. He'd written the orders himself, pulling her off the case so deliberately that it looked like a routine reassignment, and then ensuring that the SEAL received exactly the level of care that would allow him to deteriorate. The window for intervention was closing. Hannah knew it the way she knew the difference between a punctured lung and a tension pneumothorax, with the certainty of someone who diagnosed it in conditions so difficult that the battlefield looked like mercy compared to bureaucracy. A pericardiocentesis, the needle, the specific angle, the withdrawal of fluid accumulating around the heart, that procedure could buy time. It could buy days. It could buy the window needed for cardiothoracic surgery or for some kind of treatment plan beyond comfort care. But she wasn't on the case anymore. She wasn't supposed to be checking the chart. She wasn't supposed to be thinking about the fact that every doctor who'd seen that patient had looked away, and looking away was a choice, and Sterling had made sure that choice was the only one available to them. She exited the system and closed her eyes in the supply closet. Around her, the shelves held bandages and 4 bags and all the architecture of emergency medicine. The fluorescent light from the hallway cut a line under the door. She found the unit patch in her pocket, the faded fabric, frayed at the edges, with the emblem of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine sewn into the lining of her jacket, the patch she'd kept for 20 years because the boy who'd given it to her had pressed it into her hand as they loaded him onto the helicopter and said, "For luck, Angel. You get home with that and you remember we made it out." She'd made it out. She'd gotten home. She'd built a life invisible enough that no one thought to look too hard, quiet enough that no one questioned her presence, competent enough that she could help people without ever being needed. But some promises, once made, didn't have an expiration date. She put the patch back in her pocket. She stepped out of the supply closet. She walked back to post-op recovery and finished her shift, and at 6 p.m., as she was clocking out, she made a single decision. Sterling had sealed his own fate the moment he decided that isolating her from Marcus Webb would save him money instead of costing him everything. What she was about to do would give him exactly 48 hours of peace before his entire world collapsed. The alarm screamed at 2 a.m. Room for 47. Cardiac tamponade. Blood crushing the SEAL's heart in a tightening vice, pressure building where none should exist, his chest cavity becoming a closed fist. Hannah was first through the door, boots hitting linoleum, her body moving before her mind caught up. The on-call resident stood frozen beside the crash cart, his hands trembling over the defibrillator pads, his face the color of old gauze. The monitor showed a pressure dropping into catastrophic ranges. 70 systolic. 60. 55. The SEAL's lips were turning blue. "Get me an 18-gauge spinal needle," Hannah said. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't crack. 60 cubic centimeters syringe. Ultrasound probe. Now. The resident stammered, "We need to wait for the attending, we need authorization." Hannah locked the door. The click echoed through the ICU like a vault ceiling. She moved to the bedside, her hands already reaching for the sterile field, muscle memory from 2 decades of field medicine taking over completely. Pain is data. Blood pressure is a story. This story was ending unless she rewrote it in the next 90 seconds. Through the glass, Dr. Sterling appeared in his coat, still buttoning it from the parking garage where he'd been called from, his fist raising before his brain caught up. He pounded the glass. Once. Twice. His voice muffled but unmistakable. "Nurse Clarke, step away from that patient immediately." Immediately. Hannah positioned the ultrasound probe with hands steady as surgical steel, the same hands that had done this under Taliban fire in a forward operating base with mortar rounds walking across the compound, finding the precise entry point below the xiphoid process, that small notch where life and death separated by millimeters. She prepped the site with chlorhexidine. The smell of it, clean, clinical, the smell of intervention, filled the small space between her and the dying man on the bed. She advanced the needle with controlled pressure. Felt the resistance. Felt the pop as it entered the pericardial space, that membrane surrounding the heart, the place where blood was pooling and suffocating him. She began drawing back the plunger. Dark blood filled the syringe. 60 cubic centimeters. Then another 60. Then another. The pressure releasing with each pull, the life-draining weight lifting from his chest like a hand finally unclenching. The SEAL's monitor showed his blood pressure climbing. 60. 70. 80. His lips pinking. His chest rising with deeper breaths. His oxygen saturation climbing from 68% to 75, then 80, then stable at 92. Sinus rhythm. The heart that had been crushed was beating. Sterling's voice was muted fury through the glass. You just ended your career. Security is on the way. Hannah didn't look at him. She secured the needle, ran the 4 fluids, wrote the note with clinical precision. Pericardiocentesis performed, 180 cubic centimeters sanguineous fluid drained, cardiac tamponade resolved, vital stable, patient responsive. She signed it. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. Not nurse. Not orderly. Not the invisible woman in scrubs that Sterling had spent 3 months trying to erase. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Sterling. The worst part came when the door burst open. 2 security officers entered. One she recognized, the guard named Marcus who used to smile and ask about her weekend when she came in. His face was neutral now, institutional, the smile gone. Sterling pointed at Hannah. Remove that nurse. She performed an unauthorized surgical procedure. She assaulted a patient. The guard looked at Sterling. Then at Hannah. Then back at Sterling with something like comprehension dawning. Sir, you need to come with us. I'm the attending physician here. That woman violated every protocol. Not anymore, sir. Not anymore. By morning, board members had received their calls. Not from Sterling, from someone higher. Federal calls. The kind that made hospitals move fast. By noon, external investigators filled the conference room reviewing Hannah's dangerous unsupervised procedures, which turned out to be the only thing that saved a man's life. By 4 p.m., security escorted Hannah to her locker, her badge deactivated with a final beep like a period on a sentence, her belongings emptied into a cardboard box by the same guard who used to smile. She touched the unit patch one last time, faded green cloth, stitched into the lining of her jacket, the one from her first deployment, the one she'd carried every single day for 20 years. They led her out. The fluorescent lights above seemed harsher than they had on her first day, the hallway longer, her footsteps the only sound in an empty corridor. Rain had started outside, hammering the parking lot like applause for a performance no one was supposed to see. She sat in her car for exactly 3 minutes. She didn't cry. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from surviving things other people don't survive. She started the engine and drove to the cemetery. To her husband's grave. The headstone read his name and the dates and nothing else, because the important parts of him couldn't fit on stone. She stood there in the rain, mud soaking through her shoes, and whispered to the silence, I saved him. But I couldn't save myself. I failed you. I failed everyone. But that wasn't the end of the story either. 3 days later, Hannah stood in the ICU despite her termination, visiting hours technically open to family, and she'd signed the guest book as friend in handwriting that looked like someone else's name. She couldn't stay away. The man in room for 47 was still there, machines breathing for him, monitors tracking the cardiac rhythm she'd saved. She stood at the window in civilian clothes, a green jacket over her shoulders, invisible again but this time by choice. The SEAL's eyes opened for the first time. They tracked slowly across the ceiling. Then to the window. Then to her. His lips moved, cracked and dry from the breathing tube they'd finally removed that morning, forming a single word that the young nurse adjusting his for barely heard, Angel. The nurse froze. Her hand suspended over the medication pump. What did you say? The SEAL's voice came stronger, Angel 6. Sangin. The minefield. The nurse's hands trembled as she pulled his file, flipping past admission notes and lab work and doctor's orders to the combat report, reading aloud in a voice that grew steadier with each word, civilian rescue operation. Grid Echo 7. Medic with call sign Angel carried subject through active minefield under enemy fire. Subject and 16 civilians evacuated successfully. Hannah stepped back from the window. Her secret had just walked through a door she couldn't close. The phone call came to the hospital director at 6:41 a.m. The caller identified himself with 3 words: Pentagon. Naval Intelligence. Within the hour, the conference room filled. A SEAL team leader in dress uniform stood at attention, his presence filling the room like pressure changing before a storm, his voice formal and absolute, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. The room went silent. Dr. Sterling, summoned from rounds, stood in the doorway with his coffee still warm in his hands, his face draining of color as if someone had turned a valve. The team leader continued without looking away from the faces around the table, Silver Star for action under fire. A hospital board member leaned forward. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor for repeated acts of heroism. Another board member sank into a chair, understanding beginning to crystallize. Navy Cross for the operation in Sangin that officially never happened. The one that saved 17 civilians, including the man currently in our hospital. Sterling's coffee cup hit the linoleum with a sound like a gunshot. An FBI agent in a dark suit stepped forward, her badge visible for exactly 2 seconds before disappearing back into her jacket. Senior Chief Clarke testified against a defense contractor running illegal arms to insurgents. She was placed in witness protection following that testimony. Her military records were sealed. The seal has been broken by federal authority. Everything Dr. Sterling attempted to investigate about her background triggered every alarm we monitor. Sterling opened his mouth. Closed it. All his network connections, the board members he'd cultivated, the investigators he'd called, the compliance officer he'd threatened with her medical license, suddenly meaningless against federal protection protocols. Less than meaningless. Incriminating. The same security guard who'd handed Hannah her cardboard box now placed one in front of Sterling with cold professionalism, his voice empty of warmth. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Hannah stood in her civilian clothes, her hand steady at her sides, as the SEAL team leader saluted her across the crowded room. His fist came up to his chest in that gesture that meant respect, that meant brotherhood, that meant, "I see you. I remember." She raised her hand and returned the salute. And somewhere in the gesture, the invisible nurse became visible again. By morning, Dr. Sterling had activated his network with the precision of a man whose arrogance had built friendships among people equally willing to burn bridges when convenient. Board members received calls, urgent calls, the kind that came before breakfast, about Hannah's dangerous unsupervised procedures, her reckless interventions, her complete disregard for protocol. One board member was his fraternity brother from Vanderbilt. Another owed him a favor from a malpractice settlement he'd helped bury. A third had received his consulting referrals for years and understood the unspoken language of reciprocal silence. By 8 a.m., investigators appeared at Mercy General with clipboards and questions about Hannah Clarke's employment history, her background check anomalies, her deliberately sparse references that checked out but never elaborated. By noon, Sterling had filed a formal complaint alleging Hannah had performed an invasive medical procedure without physician authorization, without consent, without regard for patient safety protocols. He had witnesses, residents who'd been frozen in panic, whose testimony could be shaped like wet clay in his hands. The compliance officer, the same woman who'd helped him through his own review 3 years ago, scheduled an immediate inquiry. Sterling sat in the cafeteria at 1 p.m. with a salad he didn't eat, watching the machinery he'd built begin to turn. It was almost beautiful, really, how institutional power worked when you understood its gears. He'd broken her once already through humiliation. Now he would break her through the system itself. No one survived a federal inquiry into their credentials, not cleanly. Not without attorneys. Not without the kind of resources a fired nurse wouldn't have. Hannah didn't fight when security arrived at 2 p.m. on her 3rd day back, the day she'd been scheduled to return to the day shift, her suspension lifted, her performance file amended by an independent physician who'd reviewed the SEAL's vitals and her procedure documentation. Security arrived with a box. Not a small box. A cardboard box the size of a banker's file container, the kind used for moving offices. The guard holding it was Marcus Webb, the same man who'd smiled at her in the hallways for 3 years, who'd held the elevator for her when his hands were full, who'd asked about her husband's memorial service. He wouldn't look at her now. His movements were precise, professional, his jaw set in the expression of someone following orders he hated. Hannah's badge was deactivated with a soft electronic chirp, the sound of access revoked, of a cleared employee becoming a trespasser. 18 hours from Sterling's board calls to her escorted exit. Her locker was emptied by Marcus himself, her personal items, a family photo, a worn paperback, a jacket she'd left in case of emergencies, placed into the box with the kind of care that made the erasure worse somehow. She accepted the box without speaking. Marcus finally met her eyes for a moment, and she saw something there, recognition, apology, a conflict between orders and conscience that he'd already lost. "I'm sorry," he said, barely audible. Hannah shifted the box's weight. "You're doing your job. I understand." That was the gift she gave him, permission to obey. The lobby doors opened onto Savannah's humid afternoon, the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water. She carried the box to her truck, placed it carefully on the passenger seat, and drove to the cemetery. The rain came that evening like it had been waiting for her arrival. Hannah stood at her late husband's grave in Bonaventure Cemetery, mud soaking through her shoes, but her posture was different now than it had been 3 days ago when she'd whispered defeat into the darkness. Then she'd been a ghost. Now she was a veteran returning from a battle she hadn't known she was fighting. She wore the dress blue she'd kept sealed in a cedar closet for 3 years, midnight fabric with gold buttons, ribbons aligned in precise rows, the weight of the uniform settling on her shoulders like a weight finally bearing its proper load. The marble headstone read, Lieutenant Commander James Clarke, died in service, loved beyond measure. She knelt despite the mud, despite the rain hammering down like applause on the stone, and placed her hand where his name was carved. "I saved him," she said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "I saved that boy twice. Once in Sangin when he was 7 years old and I pulled him from rubble. Once in Savannah when his heart was dying and every doctor had given up." The rain didn't answer. The cemetery didn't argue. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone. "I didn't fail. You be proud. I didn't fail you. I didn't fail that boy. I didn't fail myself." She knelt there until the rain slowed, until her dress blues clung to her shoulders, until something inside her that had been held at gunpoint finally understood it was safe to move forward. When she stood, she left a handprint of mud on the granite, a mark that said she'd been there, that she'd carried both her grief and her strength to this place at the same time. 3 days passed. The seal-in room for 47 opened his eyes at 6:48 a.m. on a Tuesday when the morning shift was changing, when the fluorescent lights seemed less aggressive than they did at night, when the world outside the windows was beginning to admit that it might be a decent day after all. His lungs expanded without resistance. His heart maintained its rhythm without external support. The last thing he remembered was the sensation of drowning in his own blood, the ceiling tiles above him spinning like he was being pulled down a drain, and then nothing, and then a woman's voice cutting through the darkness like a blade, saying, stay with me, I've got you," and hands that moved with the terrifying precision of someone who'd held this moment before, who'd done this in the dark, who understood that pain is information and information saves lives. His eyes focused on the figure standing by the window, arms crossed, watching the city wake up. She was still wearing her navy scrubs, the same ones from 2 days ago when his vital signs began deteriorating, when the resident physician had adjusted the comfort care medications, when hope had been filed away like a closed case. She looked like she hadn't slept. She looked like a woman who'd stood guard in the darkness and not moved. "Angel," he whispered through cracked lips, the word barely formed by his throat. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. The young nurse on the morning shift, Jen, her name tag read, froze mid-vitals check. She looked at the seal, at Hannah, at the monitor showing steady rhythm. She pulled his file with trembling hands and read aloud, her voice thin, combat report mentions a female medic with call sign Angel 6. Recovered child from collapsed structure under fire. Carried patient 3 kilometers through active engagement zone. Jen looked up, her eyes moving between the file and Hannah's face, assembling the equations everyone else had somehow missed. "That's you. That was you." Hannah didn't confirm or deny. She simply turned from the window and placed her hand on the seal's shoulder, and that single gesture, the weight of it, the steadiness of it, the promise contained in that touch, was answer enough. The hospital's conference room filled within the hour. Word moved through the building like electricity through copper. The compliance director who'd just been scheduled to terminate Hannah based on Sterling's formal complaint received a phone call that changed her afternoon. The board member who'd taken Sterling's fraternity brother call received visitors. FBI agents appeared with credentials that made Mercy General's administrative staff move with the careful precision of people who understood they were no longer in control of events. The SEAL team leader arrived in dress uniform, his presence changing the air pressure the way apex predators change the atmosphere when they enter a room. He stood at attention in that conference room with 5 officers flanking him, and he spoke with the kind of voice that had commanded operations in every hostile geography the world offered. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, he said, each word separated and complete. The title landed like a detonation. Silver Star. He paused. Reactions registered around the table: shock, recalibration, the sudden understanding that they'd been wrong about who was standing in their hallways. 2 bronze stars with valor. Another pause. Longer. Deeper. The weight accumulating. Navy Cross for the operation that officially never happened. The room went silent in the way that only happens when institutional understanding suddenly rewrites itself. The compliance director's face had gone pale. The board member from Vanderbilt was examining his hands as if they might contain explanations. Sterling wasn't in the room, but he was everywhere in it, the ghost of assumptions proven catastrophically incorrect. The FBI agent beside the SEAL team leader was a woman with the kind of expression that suggested she'd delivered worse news before and would deliver worse news again. Senior Chief Clarke was placed in witness protection in 2022 after testifying against a defense contractor regarding contract fraud in the Middle East, she said, her words precise and official. Her employment records were sealed. Her background was classified. Her current identity was protected under federal statute. She paused, letting that sink in. Dr. Sterling's inquiry into her employment history triggered every alarm we have. His investigation of her background cross-referenced with sealed federal records. 12 different protocols flagged the violation. This hospital received 3 separate FBI notifications in the last 72 hours about unauthorized access to protected personnel files. The air in the room tightened like a closing fist. The compliance director's lips had gone white. She was already calculating her exposure, her culpability, the ways her name might appear in depositions. The board member was thinking about his own liability. Around the table, the physics of power were recalibrating in real time. Hannah stood in the corner of the conference room in her navy scrubs, her hand still carrying the warmth of the SEAL's shoulder, and she didn't smile. She didn't need to. The equations were solving themselves. Sterling received his termination notice at 5:17 p.m. that same day. The board member with the consulting referrals had made a call. The compliance director had compiled documentation. The federal inquiry had expanded to encompass not just fraud but obstruction, retaliation against a protected witness, deliberate interference with a federal investigation. His medical license entered immediate review. His malpractice insurance provider notified him they were reviewing coverage on all cases from the previous 5 years. His attorneys, 3 of them now, bleeding money, advised him to accept a negotiated exit from the hospital and avoid federal prosecution if he was very, very lucky. He packed his office the next morning at 6 a.m., before the shift change, before anyone could witness it properly. His colleagues who'd taken his calls, who'd celebrated his victories, who'd networked on his behalf, they were suddenly unavailable. The compliance director who'd helped him had submitted her resignation, citing ethical concerns. The board members were in damage control mode, carefully documenting their own lack of knowledge regarding his billing practices, his inquiries, his systematic campaign against Hannah Clarke. The security guard arrived with another box. It was Marcus Webb who carried it into Sterling's office. He set it down with less care than he'd used with Hannah's belongings. Sterling looked at the box, at Marcus's face, at the termination letter already being processed by HR. And for the first time in his career, he understood what it felt like to be erased by the very system he believed he controlled. Marcus said only, "I believe you know the way out, sir." Sterling took the box and walked toward the lobby doors. He didn't return for his framed diplomas. He didn't ask about severance. He simply moved through the exit like a man who'd suddenly understood that the network he'd built was made of the same material as spider silk, strong enough to carry the weight you expected, insufficient for anything else. 6 months later, Dr. Sterling was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table in a strip mall parking lot between a nail salon and a discount tire shop on the edge of Savannah, his medical degree framed on the wall of his studio apartment where nobody would see it, where it couldn't remind him of the colleagues who'd distanced themselves, the board members who'd surrendered him without resistance, the system that had consumed him the moment he challenged someone protected by something larger than institutional power. Hannah Clarke returned to Mercy General as a clinical instructor, teaching emergency procedures to residents who listened with the kind of respectful attention reserved for people who'd seen what they were training for. She taught trauma stabilization. She taught decision-making under impossible pressure. She taught composure. The young nurse who'd first read the file asked to shadow her during night shifts, and Hannah agreed without hesitation. The SEAL visited monthly, bringing others from his unit, veterans who recognized in Hannah's steady presence something they understood in their bones, the quality of someone who'd been tested in darkness and emerged still standing. They brought their own injuries to her, their own uncertainties, and she treated them with the same precision she'd used in the pericardiocentesis, the same calm that had saved lives in Sangin. On her clinical jacket, the same navy scrub top she wore during trauma rotations, the faded unit patch from Sangin remained sewn inside the lining, never removed, never displayed. It was joined at the ceremony by a new patch the SEAL had pressed into her hand, his adult fingers closing over hers the way his 7-year-old hand had reached for her through rubble 20 years before. She touched both patches each morning before her shift, their fabric worn by repetition and remembrance, connecting the child she'd saved to the warrior he'd become, connecting the medic she'd been to the nurse she was now. The closing frame shows Hannah walking through Mercy General's fluorescent hallways, navy scrubs hiding the scars on her shoulder from the classified operation that still didn't officially exist, moving among patients who would never know the decorated warrior, changing their 4 bags, checking their vitals, holding their hands in the dark when the monitors alarmed and everyone else froze. She'd learned something that night in room for 47, something that had been true since Sangin: real strength wasn't displayed. Real strength showed up. Real strength stood when the lights went out. Real strength helped when helping was the only option left. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub, saving lives in the dark. If Hannah Clarke's story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that quiet strength is still strength. And comment below, what would you have done in Hannah's position? Would you have locked that door? I want to hear your thoughts.